The sun was setting over Oak Ridge, a small town where life usually moved at a slow, predictable pace. The golden rays painted the sky orange and pink, casting long shadows on the pavement. On this particular evening, an elderly black woman walked down the street, her steps slow but steady. She carried 2 grocery bags in one hand and leaned on her cane with the other. Her name wasn't important right now. What mattered was that she was just like anyone else trying to get home after a long day. She had spent hours at the local store picking out fruits, vegetables, and a few treats for herself. It was her weekly routine, something she'd done for years without any trouble. But tonight things were about to take a turn no one could have expected. As she made her way along the sidewalk, tapping her cane rhythmically against the ground, she noticed a police car parked nearby. At first it didn't seem unusual. Cops patrolled this neighborhood often, keeping an eye out for anything suspicious. But then the officer stepped out of the car. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore his uniform with pride, or so it seemed. What people didn't know was that this man had a reputation. Over the years there had been whispers around town about him. Some said he treated certain groups differently, especially those who looked like the elderly woman walking toward him. Others claimed they'd seen him act aggressively when he thought no one was watching. None of these stories had ever been proven, though. For most folks, he was just another cop doing his job. As the woman approached, the officer narrowed his eyes. Something about her caught his attention, or maybe it was nothing at all. Maybe it was simply because she was older, or maybe it was the color of her skin. Whatever the reason, he decided to stop her. "Hey, you there," he called out, his voice sharp and commanding. The woman paused mid-step, surprised by the sudden interruption. She turned to face him, clutching her grocery bags tighter. "Yes, sir?" she asked politely, her tone calm despite the knot forming in her stomach. She wasn't used to being stopped like this, especially not while minding her own business. Instead of answering her question, the officer took a few quick strides forward until he was standing directly in front of her. His expression was hard, almost angry. "What are you doing here?" he demanded, his voice rising slightly. "Why are you loitering near this store?" The woman blinked, confused. Loitering? That word felt heavy, loaded with accusation. All she'd done was shop for groceries and head home. Wasn't that allowed? "I'm just going back to my house," she replied softly, holding up her bags as if to prove her point. "See? I bought some food." For a moment, the officer stared at her, his jaw tightening. Then, without warning, he raised his arm and shoved her backward. The force of his push sent her stumbling, and she lost her grip on the grocery bags. Apples rolled across the sidewalk, potatoes tumbled into the gutter, and her cane clattered to the ground. She fell hard, landing awkwardly on the cold concrete. Pain shot through her body, but it wasn't the physical hurt that stung the most. It was the shock, the sheer disbelief that someone whose job was to protect her could treat her this way. Tears welled up in her eyes as she struggled to sit upright, her hands trembling. She reached for her glasses, which had fallen off during the fall, but everything around her was blurry without them. People passing by froze in their tracks, unsure of what to do. A young woman standing nearby pulled out her phone and started recording the scene. Someone muttered, "That's wrong," under their breath, while another person whispered, "We should help her." But fear kept everyone rooted in place. No one wanted to risk angering the officer. The elderly woman sat there, humiliated and vulnerable, as the officer loomed over her. His words cut deeper than his actions. "You think you can walk around acting like you own the place?" he sneered, his voice dripping with disdain. "Next time, show some respect." Her heart sank. Respect? She had lived in this town for decades, paid her taxes, followed the rules, and raised a family here. And yet, in this moment, none of that seemed to matter. To him, she was nothing more than a stereotype, a faceless figure he could bully without consequence. Little did he know, however, that this encounter was far from over. Unbeknownst to both of them, someone had already picked up the phone. Someone who cared deeply about the woman lying on the ground. Someone who wouldn't stand by and let injustice go unanswered. While the officer stood over the elderly woman, his words sharp and his presence intimidating. A neighbor who had been watching from her porch couldn't stay silent any longer. Maria Lopez lived just a few houses down, and she knew the woman. Well, they'd exchanged greetings many times before, warm smiles, small talk about the weather, and occasional chats about how the neighborhood was changing. To Maria, this woman wasn't just another face on the street. She was family in the way neighbors sometimes become. Maria's heart sank as she watched what unfolded. She saw the shove, heard the harsh words, and felt her stomach twist into knots. Her hands trembled as she gripped the railing of her porch, torn between stepping in and staying safe. But then something inside her snapped. Enough was enough. This wasn't right, and someone needed to do something. Without wasting another second, Maria rushed back into her house and grabbed her phone. Her fingers hovered over the screen as she thought about who to call. The woman didn't have a husband anymore. He'd passed away years ago, but she did have a son. Maria remembered him vaguely from town events. He was tall, strong, and carried himself with a quiet confidence that made people sit up and take notice. More importantly, he had a reputation for standing up for what was right. If anyone could handle this situation, it was him. Her hands shaking, Maria dialed the number she'd saved in her contacts months ago after a brief conversation with the woman. It rang twice before a deep voice answered. "Hello?" "Hi," Maria said quickly, her voice trembling. "I'm so sorry to bother you, but it's your mom. She's outside near the store on Maple Street. There's a police officer here, and he pushed her to the ground. She's hurt and I don't know what to do." There was a pause on the other end of the line. For a moment, Maria worried he hadn't heard her or maybe wouldn't believe her. But then came the response. A single word, sharp and urgent. "What?" "She's okay, I think," Maria stammered, trying to keep her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "But she's sitting on the ground and he won't let her stand up. Please, you need to come now." The man didn't waste time asking questions. His tone shifted immediately, becoming firm and focused. "Where exactly are you?" he asked, his voice calm but laced with intensity. Maria gave him the address, describing the scene as best she could. When she mentioned the officer's behavior, she heard a low growl on the other end. Not loud enough to scare her, but enough to make her realize how serious this was. "I'll be there in 5 minutes, he said finally, his voice leaving. No room for argument. Then the line went dead. Maria hung up and peeked through her window again. The officer was still hovering over the elderly woman, his posture aggressive, his words cutting through the evening air like knives. She wanted to run outside and help, but fear held her back. Instead, she whispered a silent prayer, hoping the sun would arrive soon. Back at his house, the man moved with precision. He wasn't one to panic, even in moments like this. Years of training had taught him how to stay calm under pressure, though his mind raced with anger and worry. As he grabbed his jacket and car keys, memories flooded back. Memories of his mother working tirelessly to provide for their family, sacrificing everything so he could grow up with a roof over his head and food on the table. She deserved better than this. Everyone deserved better than this. He sped out of his driveway, his tires squealing against the asphalt. The drive to Maple Street felt longer than usual, every red light stretching into eternity. His knuckles turned white as he gripped the steering wheel, replaying Maria's words in his head. Pushed her to the ground? Hurt? What kind of monster would lay a hand on an elderly woman, especially one as gentle and kind as his mother? When he finally turned onto Maple Street, the scene came into view. A small crowd had gathered, whispering among themselves. Some looked angry, others scared. And there, in the middle of it all, was the officer, towering over his mother as she sat helplessly on the ground. The sight ignited a fire in his chest, but he forced himself to stay composed. Losing control now wouldn't help anyone. Parking his car, he stepped out and slammed the door shut. The sound echoed through the street, drawing everyone's attention. Heads turned, eyes widened, and whispers rippled through the crowd. Even the officer glanced over his shoulder, his expression shifting from annoyance to something else entirely. Recognition. At first, the officer froze, his mouth slightly open as if trying to process what he was seeing. Then, slowly, his face paled. His shoulders tensed and his hands balled into fists. It was clear he recognized the man walking toward him, though the reason why wasn't immediately obvious to the bystanders. For the elderly woman, relief washed over her when she saw her son approaching. Despite the pain in her body and the humiliation still lingering, she managed a weak smile. Her boy was here now. Everything would be all right. As the crowd parted to make way for him, the man locked eyes with the officer. There was no yelling, no dramatic gestures, just a cold, unspoken understanding between them. Whatever history they shared, it was written all over the officer's face: fear, guilt, panic. And in that moment, the balance of power shifted completely. The man's arrival felt like a storm rolling in. You could sense it in the air. Something was about to change. As he stepped out of his car, his presence commanded attention. He wasn't just tall. He carried himself with a weight that made people pause. His broad shoulders and steady stride told everyone watching that this wasn't someone who backed down easily. This was a man who had faced challenges head-on and come out stronger every time. The crowd parted instinctively as he walked toward the scene. Some whispered among themselves, others held their breath, unsure of what would happen next. The elderly woman, still seated on the ground, looked up and saw him approaching. Her eyes softened, and for the first time since the incident began, she felt a flicker of hope. Relief washed over her face, replacing the fear and humiliation that had been etched there moments before. Her son knelt beside her without hesitation, his voice calm but firm. "Mom, are you okay?" he asked, his tone filled with concern. "I nodded weakly, though her trembling hands gave away how shaken she truly was. He gently helped her sit up straighter, brushing dirt off her coat while keeping one eye on the officer standing nearby. "You shouldn't have pushed her," he said, his voice low but carrying enough authority to make the officer flinch. It wasn't a question or an accusation. It was a statement, clear and direct. But instead of responding, the officer took a step back, his confidence visibly crumbling. His earlier aggression seemed to evaporate, replaced by something else entirely: fear. To the bystanders, this reaction didn't make sense at first. Why would a police officer, a figure of authority, look so rattled by a civilian? They didn't know the history between these two men, but it was obvious that something significant lay beneath the surface. Years ago, long before today's events, the officer had crossed paths with the man during a joint operation involving local law enforcement and military personnel. At the time, the officer was new to the force, eager to prove himself but reckless in his actions. During the operation, his poor judgment put lives at risk, including those of the man's unit. When confronted, the officer tried to shift the blame, claiming he'd only followed orders. But the man, known for his leadership and integrity, didn't tolerate excuses. He remembered the exact words he'd spoken that day. "If I ever see you again, you'll regret it." Those words weren't a threat, they were a promise. And now, standing face to face with the same officer, the memory of that encounter came rushing back. For the officer, it was a nightmare come true. He had spent years trying to forget that day, hoping never to run into the man again. Yet here they were, and this time the stakes were even higher. As the man stood up, his full height making the officer seem smaller by comparison, the tension in the air grew thicker. The officer stammered, his usual bravado replaced by panic. I didn't mean, it was just protocol," he babbled, his words tumbling out incoherently. But the man didn't respond. Instead, he turned his focus back to his mother, ensuring she was stable enough to stand. "Can you walk?" he asked softly, offering her his arm for support. She hesitated but eventually nodded, gripping his hand tightly. With his help, she slowly rose to her feet, wincing slightly from the pain in her knees. The sight of her struggling fueled the man's anger, though he kept it carefully controlled. Now wasn't the time to lose his temper, not yet, anyway. The crowd watched silently, their collective gaze shifting between the man and the officer. Some clutched their phones, recording the scene, while others simply stared, captivated by the unfolding drama. One thing was clear. Whatever happened next would leave a lasting impression on everyone present. Meanwhile, the officer continued to fumble for words, clearly desperate to explain himself. "She resisted," he blurted out, pointing at the elderly woman as if blaming her would somehow justify his actions. But no one believed him. Not the crowd, not Maria, and certainly not the man. Ignoring the officer's feeble attempts at justification, the man pulled out his phone. His movements were deliberate, each action calculated. He dialed a number and spoke briefly, his voice steady but firm. "Internal Affairs," he said into the receiver. "You need to send someone to Maple Street, right now." Hanging up, he glanced at the crowd and spotted Maria, who had called him earlier. She gave him a small nod of gratitude, her expression a mix of relief and admiration. Then, turning back to the officer, he added, "And you're not leaving until they get here." The officer's face turned pale, beads of sweat forming on his forehead. He opened his mouth to protest but thought better of it. Whatever power he thought he had was gone, stripped away by the man's unwavering resolve. For the first time that evening, justice felt within reach. The officer's face was a picture of panic, his usual confidence shattered like glass. He shifted uncomfortably on his feet, glancing around as if searching for an escape route. But there was none. The man stood firmly between him and any chance of slipping away unnoticed. His presence wasn't just physical, it was magnetic, drawing all eyes to him. Even the crowd, which had been murmuring quietly among themselves, fell silent, waiting to see what would happen next. "You think this is over?" the man asked, his voice low but carrying enough weight to silence the officer mid-stammer. "You think pushing my mom to the ground is something you can just walk away from?" The officer didn't answer. Instead, he swallowed hard, his atoms apple-bobbing nervously. For someone who prided himself on authority, he suddenly looked very small, like a child caught doing something wrong. And in many ways, that's exactly what he was. His badge and uniform couldn't shield him anymore, not when the truth was laid bare for everyone to see. Meanwhile, the elderly woman leaned heavily on her son's arm, still shaky but determined to stand tall. She could feel the anger radiating off him, but she also knew her boy well enough to recognize the restraint he was exercising. He wasn't going to lash out or lose control, not here, not now. This wasn't about revenge, it was about justice. "Mom," he said gently, turning his attention back to her. "Do you want to sit down? We can wait for the paramedics." She shook her head, though her grip on his arm tightened slightly. "No," she replied softly, her voice steady despite everything. "I'm fine. Let's finish this." Her words struck a chord with him. She wasn't asking for vengeance or drama, she just wanted closure. That simple request fueled his determination even more. Whatever happened next, he vowed silently, it wouldn't end until accountability was served. As they waited for reinforcements to arrive, the crowd began to stir again. Some people stepped closer, emboldened by the man's actions. A few, even, started sharing their own stories of run-ins with the officer, their voices rising in outrage. One older man wearing a faded baseball cap spoke up loudly. "This isn't the first time he's done something like this," he declared, pointing accusingly at the officer. "He thinks he can treat people however he wants because of that badge." Others nodded in agreement, their anger palpable. Someone else chimed in, recalling how the officer had harassed a teenager last summer, accusing him of stealing a bike without evidence. Another mentioned how he'd pulled over a young woman late at night, making her cry with his harsh tone. Piece by piece, the officer's reputation unraveled before everyone's eyes. Maria, the neighbor who had called earlier, stepped forward too. Holding her phone aloft, she announced, "I recorded everything, every word, every shove. It's all right here." Her voice wavered slightly, but her resolve was clear. She wasn't afraid anymore. If anything, she felt empowered, knowing she had proof that could expose the truth. The officer's face turned even paler, if that was possible. His hands clenched into fists at his sides, but he didn't dare move. He knew better than to try anything now. The crowd was watching, phones were recording, and Internal Affairs was already on its way. There was no escaping this. When the sound of sirens filled the air a few minutes later, the tension reached its peak. 2 police cars pulled up, followed by an unmarked vehicle. Out stepped a senior officer, a man with graying hair and a no-nonsense expression. He took one look at the scene and immediately understood the gravity of the situation. Without hesitation, he ordered the offending officer to step aside. "What's going on here?" the senior officer demanded, his gaze sweeping across the group. Before anyone else could speak, the man stepped forward. "This officer assaulted my mother," he said evenly, his voice cutting through the noise. "There are witnesses and there's video footage. I've already contacted Internal Affairs." The senior officer's jaw tightened as he processed the information. Turning to the offending officer, he barked, "You're coming with us now." For a moment, the offending officer hesitated, his pride warring with the reality of his predicament. But when the senior officer gestured for backup, 2 other officers moved in quickly, cuffing him and reading him his rights. The crowd erupted into cheers, some clapping, others shouting words of encouragement to the man and his mother. But the man didn't celebrate. He simply stood there, holding his mother close, ensuring she was safe. Justice was being served, but that wasn't the end of the story. Not for him, and certainly not for the community. As the officers led the culprit away, the man turned to the crowd. "This shouldn't have happened," he said, his voice strong but tinged with sadness. "No one should ever be treated this way, especially not our elders. We need to hold people accountable, whether they wear a badge or not." His words resonated deeply with those gathered. Heads nodded in agreement, and a few people wiped away tears. What had started as a quiet evening had turned into something much bigger, a moment of reckoning for the town of Oak Ridge. As the chaos subsided and the crowd began to disperse, the man helped his mother into his car. She was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but there was a spark of hope in her eyes. For years she'd kept her head down, choosing peace over confrontation. But tonight, she realized that sometimes standing up, even indirectly, through the courage of others, was necessary to create change. And as the man drove her home, he made a silent promise to himself. This wasn't just about his mother. It was about everyone who had ever been treated unfairly, dismissed, or hurt because of who they were. He wasn't going to let this incident fade into obscurity, not this time. The next morning, the town of Oak Ridge woke up to a storm that wasn't weather-related. News of what happened on Maple Street spread like wildfire. Maria's video, uploaded late the previous night, had already gone viral. By sunrise, it was being shared across social media platforms, local news outlets, and even national headlines. The footage showed everything: the shove, the humiliation, the crowd's outrage, and the arrival of the man who turned the tables. It was raw, unfiltered, and impossible to ignore. For many residents, watching the video felt personal. Some recognized the elderly woman, others knew her son by reputation. Everyone could see themselves in the bystanders, people frozen in shock, unsure whether to intervene or stay safe. But most importantly, everyone saw the officers' actions for what they truly were: an abuse of power rooted in prejudice. The video didn't just expose one bad apple. It forced the entire community to confront uncomfortable truths about systemic injustice. By mid-morning, protests began forming outside the police station. Dozens of people gathered with signs reading, "Justice for our elders," "Accountability now," and "No more excuses." At first it was a small group, neighbors, friends, and family members, but as the day wore on, more joined in. Students skipped class to attend, teachers brought their classes to observe peacefully, and retirees stood shoulder to shoulder with young activists. Even those who rarely spoke out about politics found themselves compelled to participate. Standing at the front of the crowd was the man himself. He hadn't planned to lead anything. He'd only wanted justice for his mother. But when people looked to him for guidance, he stepped up. His calm demeanor and commanding presence made him a natural leader, someone others trusted to steer the conversation toward meaningful change rather than chaos. "This isn't just about one officer," he said into a megaphone, addressing the growing crowd. His voice carried over the murmurs and chants, drawing everyone's attention. "This is about how we treat each other. It's about respect. My mom has lived in this town for decades. She's paid her taxes, followed the rules, and raised a family here, and yet last night she was treated like she didn't belong." His words struck a chord. People nodded, some wiping away tears. They weren't just listening, they were feeling it. This wasn't abstract activism. This was real life, happening, right in front of them. "But this isn't just about my mom," he continued, pausing to let his point sink in. "How many times have you seen something similar? How many stories have gone unheard because no one recorded them? We can't keep pretending these things don't happen. If we want change, we have to demand it. Together." The crowd erupted. In applause, their cheers echoing through the streets. For the first time in years, Oak Ridge felt alive, not with anger, but with purpose. Strangers introduced themselves, exchanging stories of their own experiences with discrimination. A teenage girl bravely recounted how she'd been stopped while walking home from school simply because of the color of her skin. An older man shared how he'd been denied service at a restaurant despite living in the area for years. Each story added fuel to the fire, strengthening the resolve of everyone present. Meanwhile, inside the police station, tensions ran high. The offending officer sat in an interrogation room, his career hanging by a thread. Internal affairs investigators grilled him relentlessly, reviewing every detail of the incident. Meanwhile, the senior officers scrambled to address the public. Outcry. Press conferences were hastily organized, promises of reform were made, and assurances of transparency were given. But the community wasn't satisfied with empty words anymore. They wanted action, and they weren't going to settle for anything less. Back at the protest, the man worked tirelessly to channel the energy into constructive solutions. He met with organizers, community leaders, and concerned citizens, brainstorming ways to create lasting change. One idea gained traction quickly: town hall meetings where residents could voice their concerns directly to law enforcement officials. These meetings wouldn't be optional for the police. They would be mandatory, filmed, and open to the public. "We need accountability," the man emphasized during one of these discussions. "Not just once, but always. Trust isn't built overnight, especially when it's been broken so many times before." His mother, still recovering from her injuries, attended some of the planning sessions. Though physically weak, her spirit remained strong. She encouraged others to speak up, reminding them that their voices mattered. "If I can stand up after what happened to me," she told a group of hesitant neighbors, "then you can too. Together, we're stronger." As days turned into weeks, the movement grew beyond protests and meetings. Local businesses started, offering free services to support the cause, printing flyers, donating food for rallies, and hosting fundraisers. Schools incorporated discussions about racial equality and justice into their curriculums. Churches held prayer vigils, emphasizing forgiveness without forgetting the need for change. Even the younger generation got involved. Teenagers used social media to amplify the message, creating hashtags and organizing virtual events to reach a wider audience. Their efforts caught the attention of influencers and activists nationwide, turning Oak Ridge into a symbol of grassroots resistance against systemic injustice. Through it all, the man remained humble. He never sought the spotlight, preferring instead to focus on the work that needed to be done. When reporters asked for interviews, he politely declined, redirecting attention to the broader movement. "This isn't about me," he insisted, repeatedly. "It's about us, all of us working together to make things better." And slowly but surely, Oak Ridge began to transform. The protests sparked difficult conversations, forcing people to examine their biases and privileges. Officers who had previously turned a blind eye to misconduct now spoke out, realizing that silence only perpetuated the problem. New policies were implemented, including mandatory sensitivity training and stricter oversight for police conduct. But perhaps the most profound change was internal. Neighbors who had once kept to themselves now greeted each other warmly, united by a shared mission. Friendships formed across generations, races, and backgrounds, proving that empathy and understanding could bridge even the widest divides. For the man and his mother, the journey wasn't easy, but it was worth it. Every step forward reminded them why they had fought so hard in the first place. Justice wasn't just about punishing wrongdoing. It was about building a world where such wrongs couldn't happen again. And though the road ahead was long, they walked it together, hand in hand, with hope lighting their way. Weeks turned into months, and while the initial wave of protests and public outrage began to settle, the ripple effects of that pivotal night on Maple Street continued to shape Oak Ridge. The town wasn't the same anymore, and that was a good thing. Change was happening, not overnight but steadily, like water carving its way through stone. For the elderly woman at the center of it all, life slowly returned to normal, though normal now carried a different meaning. Her bruises had faded, but the emotional scars took longer to heal. She spent her days resting, surrounded by neighbors, who visited often to check on her. Some brought soup or baked goods, others simply sat with her, sharing stories or sitting in comfortable silence. These small acts of kindness reminded her that she wasn't alone, that people cared deeply about what had happened to her and were determined to ensure it never happened again. Her son remained her rock, always nearby when she needed him. He helped around the house, ran errands, and made sure she felt safe whenever she ventured outside. But he also encouraged her to step back into her routine, gently nudging her to reclaim pieces of her independence. One afternoon, as they sat together, on her porch watching the sunset, she turned to him with tears in her eyes. "I'm proud of you," she said softly, her voice trembling. "You stood up for me, not just for me, but for everyone. I don't know if I could have done the same." He reached over and took her hand, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "Mom, you've been standing up your whole life," he replied. "Every time you worked 2 jobs to keep us fed, every time you smiled despite how hard things got. You showed me what strength looks like. All I did was follow your example." She smiled through her tears, squeezing his hand back. In that moment, they both understood something profound. This fight wasn't just about justice, it was about love. Love for family, for community, and for the belief that everyone deserved to live without fear. While the mother and son focused on healing, the broader community kept pushing forward. The town hall meetings became a cornerstone of Oak Ridge's transformation. Held monthly, these gatherings provided a platform for residents to voice their concerns directly to law enforcement officials. At first, tensions ran high. Some officers bristled under scrutiny, while some citizens struggled to articulate their grievances without anger spilling over. But over time, the conversations grew more constructive. The man played a key role in facilitating these discussions. He didn't lead them in the traditional sense, he wasn't interested in titles or positions, but he guided the tone, ensuring that emotions stayed grounded in respect and understanding. When tempers flared, he stepped in calmly, reminding everyone of the shared goal, creating a safer, fairer town for everyone. One particularly memorable meeting involved a young boy named Ethan, who had witnessed an officer yelling at his father during a traffic stop weeks earlier. Ethan, barely 10 years old, stood nervously at the microphone, clutching a crumpled piece of paper with notes scribbled in pencil. His voice shook as he recounted the incident, describing how scared he felt, seeing his dad treated so harshly. "I thought they were going to hurt him," Ethan admitted, his eyes filling with tears. "Why does it feel like we're always in danger?" The room fell silent. No one moved, no one spoke. Even the officers seated at the front table looked visibly shaken. Finally, the police chief leaned forward, addressing Ethan directly. "Can't undo what happened to your family," he said, his voice heavy with sincerity. "But I promise you we're working to make sure it doesn't happen again. You shouldn't have to feel afraid because of us." It was a small moment, but it carried immense weight. For the first time, many residents saw vulnerability in the officers, a willingness to acknowledge mistakes and commit to improvement. That shift in perspective opened doors for deeper dialogue, fostering trust where there had once been only suspicion. Beyond the town halls, other initiatives sprang up across Oak Ridge. A group of volunteers launched a mentorship program connecting teenagers with local leaders, including teachers, business owners, and even retired officers eager to rebuild bridges. Art projects popped up around town, with murals painted on walls depicting themes of unity and resilience. One mural, located near the site of the original incident, featured a silhouette of an elderly woman holding hands with a younger figure, symbolizing generational solidarity. The local library hosted workshops on racial equity and bystander intervention, teaching attendees practical ways to challenge injustice when they saw it. Schools incorporated similar lessons into their curriculums, encouraging students to think critically about fairness and empathy. Teachers reported seeing noticeable changes in classroom dynamics, with kids becoming more aware of each other's feelings and backgrounds. Even businesses got creative in supporting the movement. A popular cafe introduced a pay-it-forward system, allowing customers to buy coffee or meals for frontline activists and volunteers. Another shop owner hung a sign in the window reading, "This space is safe for everyone." Such gestures might have seemed small individually, but collectively, they created a tapestry of hope and determination. For the offending officer, consequences came swiftly. After an extensive investigation by Internal Affairs, he faced multiple charges, including assault and misconduct. Though legal proceedings dragged on for months, the outcome was clear. He would never wear a badge again. To many, this closure felt satisfying but bittersweet. Justice had been served, yet it couldn't erase the pain caused by his actions. What mattered most, however, was the lesson learned, not just by the officer himself, but by the entire department. New policies were implemented requiring body cameras for all officers, along with stricter guidelines for use of force. Training programs emphasized de-escalation techniques and cultural sensitivity, aiming to prevent future incidents. While skepticism lingered among some residents, most agreed that progress was worth celebrating, even if challenges remained. As winter approached, bringing colder temperatures and shorter days, Oak Ridge prepared for its annual holiday festival. This year, the event carried special significance. Organizers decided to dedicate it to unity and resilience, inviting speakers from diverse backgrounds to share messages of hope. Booths lined the streets offering handmade crafts, warm drinks, and information about ongoing initiatives. On opening night, the man accompanied his mother to the festivities. Wrapped in a thick coat and leaning on her cane, she navigated the crowd with a smile, stopping occasionally to chat with familiar faces. Children ran past, laughing and clutching candy canes, while carolers sang cheerful tunes nearby. Despite the chill in the air, warmth radiated throughout the square. Standing beside a large tree adorned with twinkling lights, the man glanced around at the bustling scene. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel pride, not in what he'd accomplished personally, but in what the community had achieved together. They hadn't erased prejudice or solved every problem overnight, but they had taken monumental steps toward a brighter future. His mother tugged gently on his sleeve, pulling him from his thoughts. "Look at this place," she said, gesturing to the lively crowd. "Doesn't it feel different?" He nodded, smiling. "Yeah, Mom, it really does." And for the first time in a long time, that difference felt like progress. As the years passed, Oak Ridge continued to evolve. The town wasn't perfect, no place ever is, but it was undeniably better than it had been before that fateful evening on Maple Street. What started as a single act of courage had sparked a chain reaction, transforming not just policies and procedures but hearts and minds. And while the man and his mother remained at the heart of the story, they weren't alone in shaping its outcome. It was the collective effort of everyone who refused to look away, who stood up when it mattered most. One spring morning, nearly 3 years after the incident, the elderly woman woke up feeling lighter than she had in ages. She opened her curtains to let sunlight stream into her living room, illuminating photos on the walls that told the story of her life. There were pictures of family gatherings, birthdays, holidays, and now framed newspaper clippings about the movement she'd unintentionally inspired. To her, those articles weren't trophies. They were reminders of how far the town had come. She dressed carefully, choosing a bright floral dress that matched the season. Today was a special day, the unveiling of a memorial garden dedicated to unity and resilience. The idea had come from the community itself, proposed during one of the town hall meetings. "We need a space," someone had said, "where people can reflect, heal, and remember why we're doing this work." The proposal received overwhelming support, and volunteers worked tirelessly to bring the vision to life. When she arrived at the site later that afternoon, leaning on her cane and accompanied by her son, she was greeted with applause. Dozens of residents had gathered for the ceremony, including many familiar faces. Maria, the neighbor who had called for help that night. Ethan, the boy who had bravely spoken out at the town hall, and countless others whose lives had been touched by the events of the past few years. Even some former skeptics showed up, curious to see what all the fuss was about. The garden was breathtaking. Lush greenery surrounded winding pathways lined with benches, inviting visitors to sit and reflect. At the center stood a sculpture, a tree with branches stretching skyward, crafted from bronze and etched with words contributed by the community. Respect, empathy, justice, hope. Beneath it lay a plaque inscribed with a simple message: dedicated to those who dared to stand tall. As the mayor gave a speech, thanking everyone for their contributions, the elderly woman found herself overcome with emotion. Tears welled up in her eyes as she listened to stories of how the movement had impacted people's lives. Parents spoke of teaching their children about fairness and kindness. Business owners shared tales of hiring practices becoming more inclusive. Former rivals described mending fences and finding common ground. When the microphone was passed to her son, he hesitated briefly before stepping forward. He hadn't planned to say much, he rarely did, but something about the moment compelled him to speak from the heart. "This garden represents more than just progress," he began, his deep voice carrying across the crowd. "It's a symbol of hope, yes, but also of responsibility. We've come so far, but there's still work to be done. Change doesn't happen overnight, and it doesn't happen without effort. So let this be a reminder, to ourselves and to future generations, that we have the power to shape our world. Together." His words resonated deeply, drawing murmurs of agreement from the audience. When he finished speaking, the applause was thunderous, echoing through the trees like a promise kept. But the transformation extended beyond public spaces and ceremonies. In quieter, more personal ways, Oak Ridge became a kinder, more compassionate place. Neighbors checked in on each other regularly, forming bonds that transcended differences in age, race, or background. Schools implemented programs encouraging students to celebrate diversity, hosting cultural festivals where families shared food, music, and traditions. Even local businesses adopted practices aimed at inclusivity, from hiring employees from marginalized communities to offering discounts to low-income households. For the elderly woman, these changes were evident in her daily routine. Grocery store, clerks greeted her warmly, remembering her preferences and asking how she was doing. Strangers held doors open for her, offered to carry her bags, or simply smiled as they passed by. Each small gesture reminded her that she belonged, not just in this neighborhood but in this world. Her son noticed the shift, too. Though he remained vigilant, always ready to step in if needed, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't experienced in years. Knowing that his mother could walk down the street without fear meant everything to him. Still, he didn't rest on his laurels. He continued attending town halls, mentoring young activists, and advocating for systemic reforms. His commitment inspired others to stay engaged, ensuring that the momentum wouldn't fade. Of course, challenges persisted. Not everyone embraced change willingly. Some residents grumbled about political correctness or complained that the focus on equity went too far. A handful of officers resisted new training requirements, clinging to old habits despite warnings from superiors. Progress, after all, is rarely linear. Yet even in moments of resistance, there was growth. When disagreements arose, people learned to listen rather than shout. Conversations replaced confrontations and compromise became possible. The man often reminded the community that perfection wasn't the goal, improvement was. Every step forward, no matter how small, counted. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting golden hues over the town, the elderly woman sat on her porch with her son. They sipped tea in comfortable silence, watching fireflies dance in the twilight. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Finally, she broke the quiet. "Do you think we made a difference?" she asked softly, her gaze fixed on the horizon. He turned to look at her, his expression thoughtful. "I know we did," he replied. "Not because of me or you alone, but because of everyone who joined us. This town isn't perfect, Mom, but it's trying. That's what matters." She nodded slowly, a contented smile spreading across her face. "Good," she said. "That's all I ever wanted, for people to try." They sat together until the stars emerged, twinkling above like promises waiting to be fulfilled. In that moment, surrounded by the beauty of the night and the warmth of connection, they knew the journey was worth every struggle. And though challenges lay ahead, they faced them with hope, knowing that Oak Ridge, and perhaps the world beyond it, was moving in the right direction. Years rolled by, and Oak Ridge became known not just as a quiet town but as a beacon of resilience and unity. People from neighboring cities began visiting to learn how such profound change had taken root in what was once an ordinary suburb. Journalists wrote articles, filmmakers made documentaries, and community leaders from across the country came to attend workshops and conferences hosted by the town's residents. The story of the elderly woman and her son wasn't forgotten. It grew into a legend of sorts, a reminder that even the smallest acts of courage could ignite monumental transformations. The memorial garden, now a cherished landmark, became a gathering place for all kinds of events. Weddings were held there, with couples planting saplings near the bronze tree to symbolize new beginnings. Vigils took place under its branches when tragedies struck elsewhere, offering solace to those grieving. And every year on the anniversary of the incident, the entire town gathered at the garden for a celebration of progress, a day filled with music, speeches, and shared meals. For the elderly woman, these gatherings brought both joy and reflection. She loved seeing families spread blankets on the grass, children running between flower beds, and friends laughing over plates of food. But she also felt a deep sense of responsibility. This wasn't just a garden, it was a promise, a living testament to the idea that kindness and justice mattered more than fear or division. Her son often stood beside her during these events, tall and steady, watching over the crowd like a guardian. Though he never sought recognition, people gravitated toward him naturally, seeking advice or simply wanting to thank him. To them, he represented strength and integrity, qualities they hoped to embody in their own lives. Yet despite his role in sparking the movement, he always redirected praise to the community. "This isn't my victory," he would say whenever someone complimented him. "It belongs to everyone who dared to care, to the teachers who taught empathy, the kids who stood up against bullying, the officers who admitted they needed to do better. Change doesn't come from one person. It comes from all of us working together." As time went on, the elderly woman's health began to decline. Age caught up with her, slowing her steps and softening her voice. Still, she refused to let it dim her spirit. Even when walking became difficult, she insisted on attending important events, leaning heavily on her cane, or sometimes her son's arm. Her presence alone inspired others to keep pushing forward no matter how hard things got. One chilly autumn afternoon, she attended a school assembly where students were presenting projects about local heroes. As she sat in the front row wrapped in a shawl, she listened intently as a young girl stepped up to speak. The child was nervous, clutching index cards in trembling hands, but her words carried immense power. "I chose to talk about this lady," the girl said, pointing directly at the elderly woman, "because she showed me that standing up for yourself isn't just brave, it's necessary. When I heard her story, I realized something important. If someone tries to push you down, you don't have to stay there. You can rise again and bring others with you." The room erupted in applause, and the elderly woman wiped away tears, smiling through them. That moment stayed with her long after the assembly ended, filling her with pride not just for herself, but for the next generation. These children weren't afraid to dream of a fairer, kinder world, and they were determined to make it happen. When winter arrived that year, the elderly woman fell ill. It wasn't sudden, but it was inevitable. Her son stayed by her side constantly, reading aloud from her favorite books, holding her hand, and sharing stories of their journey together. On quiet nights, they reminisced about everything they'd been through, the struggles, the victories, the moments of laughter and love. "Do you regret any of it?" he asked her one evening, his voice barely above a whisper. She shook her head slowly, her eyes twinkling despite her frailty. "No," she replied firmly. "Not a single moment. Every challenge we faced led us here, to a better place, surrounded by people who care. If I had to live it all over again, I wouldn't change a thing." Her words comforted him, though he knew he would miss her deeply when the time came. But even in saying goodbye, there was peace. She had lived a life full of purpose, leaving behind a legacy that would endure long after she was gone. The day she passed away, the town mourned collectively. Flags flew at half-staff, businesses closed early, and flowers piled high at the base of the bronze tree in the garden. At her funeral, hundreds gathered to pay their respects, not just family and friends, but neighbors, activists, and even former adversaries who had since changed their ways. Everyone agreed. She hadn't just been a pillar of the community, she had been its heart. In her memory, the town planted a new tree near the garden, a cherry blossom chosen because of its beauty and resilience. Each spring, its pink blooms would remind everyone of her warmth and grace. Beneath it, they placed a plaque inscribed with her favorite quote, "Kindness costs nothing, but it's worth everything." Though she was gone, her influence remained. Her son continued carrying the torch, ensuring that her values lived on. He visited schools, spoke at community events, and mentored young leaders eager to follow in his footsteps. Slowly, he began stepping back, trusting that the next generation was ready to take charge. After all, the fight for justice wasn't confined to one person or one era. It was a Li Bang, relay baton, passed from hand to hand, generation to generation. And so, Oak Ridge thrived. Challenges still arose, of course. They always would. But the town faced them with the same determination that had defined it since that night years ago. People remembered the lessons learned, that silence in the face of injustice only perpetuated harm, that accountability required action, and that love and understanding could bridge even the widest divides. As the sun set over the town, one final time in this story, casting golden light over streets lined with trees and homes filled with hope, it was clear that Oak Ridge had become more than just a place. It was a testament to what could happen when ordinary people chose to stand up, speak out, and believe in something greater than themselves. And somewhere, perhaps watching from above, the elderly woman smiled. Her work here was done, but the ripple effects of her courage would continue spreading, touching lives far beyond what anyone could imagine.